Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are talking about organizing and outlining our speeches, which is one of the most important aspects of any presentation. It's just like anything. When you're starting it from scratch, you need to have an idea of where you're going and a process. And in most things, whether it be a recipe or building something, whatever you look at, you have a process that needs to be followed in order to create the best possible product. Now, particularly with something like a recipe, if you think about it, you can follow a recipe and get a pretty good end result if you follow it well. But depending on the recipe, you're going to get a different result. And that's exactly what you're going to get when you do different things with the way that you organize and outline your ideas for any speech. So today we're going to talk about particularly organizational patterns and outlining, but also introductions and conclusions. So really the nuts and bolts of what you need for your presentation. Now, this is the process that I typically go through when I'm writing a presentation, whether that be a lecture for a class, a presentation about something, or some kind of really anything, any professional setup. I start with my topic. So what do I want to talk about? I think about the context, the setting, and ultimately I ask myself why. Why do I want to talk about that topic? And if I don't get a good answer, if I don't get a good answer from myself about, maybe I want to talk about that topic because I find it interesting, or I want to talk about it because it's important for my audience or it's important for what I'm talking about, then I will move on to a different topic. But if I get past that first initial why question and I can answer why do I want to talk about it, and it gets me to a center or to be audience centered like we've talked about, then I'll ask myself, so what? And that's essentially the question of who cares? Why will my audience care about what I have to say about this topic? And that's where it gets really tricky. If you think about asking yourself those questions, why and so what, it's pretty difficult sometimes to really answer those questions truthfully and objectively and be able to say, you know, my audience really might not care too much about this, but should I change my topic? Yes or no? And again, it depends on the context. But again, you want to have that audience-centered idea when you're selecting your topic. Once you have your topic, you want to start with your organizational pattern. You want to start with thinking about how you're going to organize your ideas before you get into really the detail, before you get into writing your speech. And quite simply, that's because if you write your speech first and you just kind of wing it and free write, you end up with a result that might not be as good as it could have been if you were more strategic. And your ideas won't be organized in a very clear and concise way, but your speech is done. So you're not going to go back and start all over and change everything up. So again, it goes back to this idea of early feedback, early preparation, and practice. Make sure that you start early, and when you are starting your speech, start thinking about how you want to organize your ideas, what do you want to say. So the first organizational pattern we'll talk about today is chronological. We'll then talk about topical, spatial, comparative, problem solution, and causal. So once we identify our organizational pattern, I then move into a pretty detailed thought process about my thesis. Really, the goal is to get to something that's simple and declarative. What is going to be easy for my audience to digest? What is going to be easy for me to say multiple times and to remind them? But also, what's going to create a sense of urgency, a sense of I need to know a little bit more about this. And it really comes down to word choice and swapping out words and thinking about words again as symbols and as tools to share our ideas. That's really, really important because a good thesis statement will make a really big impact on your speech. So you need it to be simple and declarative. But when you're writing a thesis for a speech, it's different than writing a thesis for an essay. When you're writing a thesis for an essay, it can be complicated. It can be complex. You can have conjunctions because as a reader, you can go back through and reread. But as a speaker, you only have one opportunity to say that and say it well and make sure your audience gets the idea of your speech and what you want to say from the time you start to the time you end, because there's no going back after that. So there's a huge emphasis on simplicity and on clarity and really, really being detailed and purposeful about what words we choose, what we say, and how are we getting our ideas from our mind to our audience's mind. What do we need to do to achieve that goal? Once I have my thesis down, select a main point or start thinking about my main points. I've got my organizational patterns. I already know how I'm going to organize the ideas as a whole, But now I want to start to work with those, and I need to add a little bit and take a little bit away so that we can get that parallel structure, so that when I look at my outline, I can see that everything's fairly balanced. And that'll bring a level of balance to my presentation. Again, just like a recipe. If you have too much salt, too much pepper, too much sugar, whatever it might be, it's going to alter the end result. And you need to find a balance that'll get you to that final product that you really, really want. And that's where that parallel structure comes into play. Again, with the organizational pattern, parallel structure, it's going to change the way that you organize your main points. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. Following the development of my main points, I need to start thinking about my subpoints. My subpoints are going to be my examples, my facts, my stories, my statistics, my numbers, the things that help solidify the foundation of what I'm trying to say, what ideas I'm trying to get across. This is where I'm typically going to bring in most of my research. I'm going to cite my sources here, and I'm going to try and build a case, build an argument from literally from the ground up, if you think about it, because we start with the topic and then we have to build from there. Or you can think about it as you're trying to get your audience from point A to point B, which is where the beginning of the speech, the end of the speech, somewhere in the middle, we teach our audience something, whether that be why we want them to change the way they're doing something in a persuasive, teach them some information about the informative, or inform our audience about something that relates to a ceremony or a ceremonial type of speech. So with our first organizational pattern, this is one of the more complicated factors that come into play when we are talking about speech writing, because it's really not just about writing down our ideas. We have to think about how they're going to be organized, how they're going to flow together, and that is where these organizational patterns come into play. So our first organizational pattern is called a chronological organizational pattern. So organizational pattern is time-based, so you would organize your main points based on time. So beginning to end, end to beginning, something related to time. This organizational pattern is really good for current events, historical events, anything, historical, anything related to the passage of time. So say, for example, I wanted to do a speech about the development of Listerine, but maybe not so much like the mouthwash Listerine, but I want to inform my audience about who Joseph Lister was. And that's the person that Listerine was named after. I would talk about Joseph Lister in his early life, Joseph Lister's professional life, Joseph Lister later in his life. So through that passage of time, I could essentially tell this story of Joseph Lister, but in doing so, inform my audience about the development of Listerine and another person who was studying bacteria at a similar time as Louis Pasteur. So organizational patterns that are organized through the use of time are called chronological organizational patterns. Next up, we have spatial organizational patterns. And these organizational patterns organize our ideas based on passage through physical space. So not necessarily outer space, but just passage through physical space. So if I want to talk about my commute from my home to work and how that could be adjusted, I would use a spatial organizational pattern because I'm talking about one point in space to another, and then I would connect the dots using different landmarks, different factors, whatever I wanted to within that space. Another example here could be the migration patterns of the monarch butterfly. We start from one point to another point to another point to another point, and as I work through that migration pattern, we make little stops along the way, kind of like a tour guide, or if you're on a trip, you're going to make little stops along the way to gather some information, to learn, to maybe take a break, something along those lines. But at each point, we're moving through space, so it would be very similar to that. After spatial, we have topical, and topical is our least structured organizational pattern, but it's also the most heavily used, which is problematic because on the surface level, it seems like the easiest because we don't have to put a lot of cognitive work into thinking about how we want to organize our ideas. We can just do it however we want. The trick to a good topical organizational pattern, though, is using good, solid transitions to link your ideas together. And this is typically where these organizational patterns fall short because instead of developing really detailed, really eloquent transitions, we end up saying first, next, last as our little signposts for our main points. Well, that's not great because we're not linking our ideas together. There's no continuity in what we're saying. It just ends up being an introduction, point paragraph, main point paragraph, main point paragraph, and then maybe a conclusion at the end, but there's no flow to it. There's no through line that links our ideas together. We really, really need that. So you could use topical organizational patterns for a variety of things. So maybe you don't want to just talk about a person. So say for a commemorative speech, you don't want to talk about that person's life from point A to point B to point C, or that person and their passage through time. So maybe they were an explorer and they moved from one point to another point to another point. But you want to talk about everything that encompasses that person's life and what made them noteworthy. You would want to talk about when they were born, where they were born, or what they did, and then something else about them. Well, now you have to link these kind of differing, conflicting ideas together using your transitions, and that's where the trick to a good topical organizational pattern comes in, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of practice. Following topical, we have comparative. This is exactly what it sounds like. If you're using a comparative organizational pattern, you're comparing things. Comparing and contrasting, you're highlighting the pros and the cons of something, you're highlighting the pros and the pros of something and determining which one is best, right? So whenever you're comparing two or more things, you're going to want to use a comparative organizational pattern. It's going to organize your ideas in a way that makes it flow together really well. Similarly to a comparative, we have a problem and solution organizational pattern, which again is exactly what it sounds like. You have a problem and then you have a solution. And your main point number one, you're talking about the problem. Main points 2, 3, 4, you're talking about the solution or possible solutions. This particular organizational pattern works really well for big problems. So like world hunger, lack of access to clean water, climate change. There's so many different options for problem and solution. The trick to this one is spending enough time on the problem to really explain and unpack why this is a problem and how we know that these solutions or this solution is the best possible option, the best movement forward. Following problem and solution, we have our final organizational pattern, which is causal. So this is where you are essentially making an argument that something caused an effect. And this is very, very challenging to do. You don't see it very often. We talk about causation a lot in our day-to-day lives and our public discourse, but we don't talk about it in the right way. If you've taken a statistics course, you hopefully remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. And it's incredibly difficult to show that something caused an effect. It might look like something caused that effect, but does that mean that if we recreate those variables in that setting, is it going to cause that same effect again? And this is where a lot of the miscommunication about causation comes into play. Because in order to prove causation, you have to prove to within above 95% probability that when you do this one thing, this effect is going to follow in the same way. And there can't be a lot of variance in there. So organizational patterns that use a causal organizational pattern to organize our ideas are very, very challenging. I would recommend trying to rework what you want to say. Instead of saying this caused something, you can talk about it and think about it in a different way that will get you to a much simpler presentation, a clearer presentation, and one that is stronger, more forceful. You have a better argument behind it. So now that we've selected our organizational patterns, we need to start thinking about our introduction and our conclusion. But the introduction is the most important part of your speech. Now you're going to hear me say that about a lot of different things, because to have a really good presentation, you need to have a lot of things go well, and you have to put a lot of thought and strategy behind it. But your introduction is meant to capture your audience's attention and make your audience want to listen to you. This is really, really important because psychologically we tend to remember the beginning and the end of something, the start and the end, and the middle ground gets a little fuzzy, which is part of why we need to have that organizational pattern, that clarity, that symmetry throughout our speech so that it's easy to remember, it's easy to follow, and our audience wants to follow along. But we can't do that if we don't get that first initial chunk out of the way, and we have to get our audience engaged with what we're saying. So with your introductions, you have 4 different functions or 4 different purposes of an introduction. Number 1, and this is the really important part, is to gain your audience's attention and curiosity. This should take a little bit of time. You shouldn't just ask your audience a question. How many of you have been asked a question before? Okay, great. 5 seconds into your speech, and maybe your audience is engaged, but probably not, especially for the context of this class where you're hearing a lot of speeches. You start asking a lot of questions, it becomes less and less and less effective. So what do? You need to think of a specific strategy that you think will get your audience's attention. It'll get your audience engaged and hooked into what you're saying and curious about what you have to say. Once you've done that, you need to start thinking about how can I get my audience to give me their will or to make them want to listen to me. Because yes, we might be curious, but that doesn't mean that we are going to want to listen to you or to put the energy into active listening, especially if it's 1 p.m, it's right after lunchtime, everybody's a little sluggish and needs a nap. What do you do to get your audience engaged? How do you get your audience engaged, and how do you get your audience to want to listen to you? This is where those appeals to ethos come into play. So you can link those first two functions together. And if you have a really good attention gainer, you can develop the curiosity and the energy around your speech. You can get your audience to want to listen to you. And then you need to state the purpose of your speech or tell your audience what your thesis is. Why are you there? Are you there to inform us about the importance of this topic? Are you there to try and get us to change the way we're thinking about something or change the way that we're acting? That is really, really important because it should be transparent. If you have, say, a persuasive speech, it doesn't need to be a surprise or a secret what you're trying to do. If you have a good argument, if you have a good solid stance, I should be able to tell you, I'm going to try to persuade you to do this today, and we're going to talk about it, and we'll see what you think at the end. I should be able to tell you that and have a good argument and still get you to do what I would like for you to do. Following the statement of our thesis and the statement of our purpose, we have the preview of the main points. This is just one simple sentence that says, here's what we're going to talk about today. So this might sound like, today we're going to talk about blank, blank, and blank. Main point 1, main point 2, and main point number 3. Excuse me. So we want to preview our main ideas. This is essentially telling our audience where we're going. The overall function of your introduction is to tell your audience what you're about to tell them. Say, hey, here's what we're going to talk about. Here's where we're going. Here's what we're going to think about. Here's what we're going to do. And here's why you should pay attention to this middle portion. Because again, the middle portion can sometimes get fuzzy. Now, there are of course, some do's and don'ts when it comes to particularly attention-gaining strategies. So some things that you want to do are tell a story. We've already addressed how stories really deeply impact human beings. It's very deep-seated in the way that we communicate, the way that we think, the way that we talk, the way that we have historically shared information and do today. So tell a story. It's always a good way to get your audience engaged. Number 2, refer to an occasion. Especially if you're doing a commemorative speech or ceremonial speech, refer to some specific occasion that will kind of create some curiosity about it. Maybe somebody didn't know that happened in that place or something of that nature. Discuss recent or historical events. Again, it's a really great way to get your audience engaged, especially if it's something that's relevant to your audience and to your topic right now, but you need to be aware of the setting. You don't want to violate too many norms and alienate your audience to the point where they don't want to listen to you because they weren't expecting what you were going to say, or they weren't expecting you to go in the direction you went. So you have to be very purposeful about what you want to say. You can use startling statistics, but like other things, this can be distracting. So, or overused, just like asking a question. So if you're going to use a startling statistic, add it in with something, layer it in. Don't just bombard your audience with a bunch of information straight out of the gate. Asking a question is a great way to get your audience curious about something, but it's not the best attention-gaining strategy. So again, this can be used if you have a short speech or you just really quickly want to be like, hey, I need to get my audience engaged, or try to get your audience engaged. It's a fine strategy, but it can be overused, and I would recommend doing something with a little bit more detail. Last but not least, we have humor. Now, if you're funny, you can use humor really well. If you're not funny, people will laugh. Your audience will laugh for the first minute or two, and then they'll stop laughing. So you want to be really careful with the way that you use humor. You can use it in your introduction, but just be careful. Some things to avoid are distractions. So you want to avoid telling super distracting stories or super jarring stories. You won't want to, say you're doing a speech about human trafficking, you don't want to tell a really detailed narrative about somebody being trafficked. That's not a good way to get your audience engaged. And I hear that happen pretty often. And if you think about it, that could be super jarring for the people in your audience, especially if you unwittingly have people in your audience that have experienced something of that nature firsthand. So you want to be sensitive to the fact that you might have people in your audience that won't go over well with, and then you want to adjust because, again, we want to be audience centered. You want to avoid loud noises. So a while back, I was taking a class at American River College. It was a small group communication class, and we were doing group presentations. This other group, they had a student whose one job was to do the introduction and conclusion, which for those of you that have done group work before, sometimes that seems like the easy work, but really it's the hard work because your presentation is hinging on the success of that introduction and conclusion. Well, the student walks in, pulls an air horn out of their pocket, blows the air horn, and says, "Okay, now that I have your attention, so-and-so is going to talk about this today," and goes on. Well, that's not a great introduction. You didn't get our attention. You just distracted us. It was very jarring. You didn't tell us what your speech was about. You didn't preview anything. You didn't lay any kind of groundwork for your group mates. And all of a sudden, now speaker number one is starting with nothing, really. And they have to dive into this thing that nobody's prepared to listen to. So you have to think about your introduction. You have to think about what you want to do without distracting your audience. So you don't want to make loud noises. You want to avoid rude jokes most of the time. And you really, really want to avoid using too much humor. So this is kind of weird because I have humor in the yes and the no column. So we need to find a balance. Too much humor damages your credibility and takes away from your speech as a whole. A little bit of humor at the beginning can do a really good job to get your audience engaged. Again, if you think back to that TED Talk by Will Stevens, we can see that. And this gets us to conclusions, which is also, ironically, the end of our lecture today. So our introductions have a specific purpose, and that's to capture our audience and then to inform our audience, let them know what we're talking about that day. Conclusions, the purpose is to solidify what we just talked about. So first and foremost, we need to prepare our audience to end, to let our audience know that that last chunk where we need to focus psychologically, that's here. And so really pay attention. So we want to prepare our audience to end. You can say, in conclusion, my final thoughts, the last thing I'll say today, I'll leave you with these couple of ideas. There's a variety of things you can do to signpost or to highlight that you are moving to the end of your presentation. Once you do that, you want to restate your thesis or restate your main ideas. Remind everybody of what you just talked about, that really big, important idea. You then want to highlight and review your main points. So this is not an opportunity to go back in and re-talk about everything. You just want to briefly glance over everything by saying something along the lines of, so today we've talked about organizational patterns and how to organize our ideas based on different types of information. We've talked about introductions and the functions of introductions and what you should find in any introduction. And then we talked about conclusions and the purpose of a conclusion and what structural aspects we should find in every conclusion. And then we want to end with something strong. You want to end with some kind of strong final statement, a final idea, a statistic, tell the end of a story. You can get really creative with this, but always say thank you at the end of your speech. This signifies to your audience that you're done talking, but also it's nice to thank them for their energy and for putting the time in to listen to you. This is not an opportunity to bring in new information. It's not an opportunity to do other things. Really what you want to do is to get your audience on board with what you were saying and to remind them what you just said. So you don't want to challenge them. As you all know, you're human beings. When you're challenged, you dig your heels in a little bit. You want to make your challenges sound like requests. So if you're asking your audience to think about something differently, to function differently, to act differently, you want to make it sound like a request and not a challenge. Challenges really don't go over very well most of the time. And last but not least, you need to tell your audience what you just told them. That's the really, really important part here. Thinking all the way back to the beginning, introductions, tell your audience what you just told them. Then you tell them using a clear and concise organizational pattern that has your main points structured properly with adequate support to get your ideas across. And then in the conclusion, you say to your audience, here's what I just told you. And you restate your thesis, review your main ideas, and you end with some kind of satisfying conclusion. And then last but not least, you thank everybody. So thank you for listening.